This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Every year we have the same conversation with OTAs. Without doubt. Right. And I'm convinced that this happens because there's just not much to talk about. Right. Like, what else are people going to write about other than, who showed up to OTAs, and is that a problem or is it not? And it gets everybody going. Right. Because everybody makes these arguments about OTAs about themselves. Right. It's never really about if the OTAs are actually important, if the OTAs are actually useful to that player. It's always something about the person making the argument in one direction or another, right? Like the people who really get up in arms about players not showing up to OTAs, you usually hear the same stuff. Oh, these players are lazy. Oh, you got to show up to work. Oh, this is bad leadership. It's what they got to do with anything. Like, we're talking about a voluntary practice, but a lot of the times the arguments that you get about OTAs from either side are usually about the people making the argument, right? It's people feeling like, hey, when I have to go to work and they say something's mandatory, it's not actually mandatory. So that's the same thing in the NFL. Or is people saying, hey, man, when I go to work and something's voluntary, it's voluntary. So it's the same thing in the NFL. You see what I mean here? Very rarely are we actually talking about the players when it comes to stuff like this. We're just trying to talk about ourselves, and we're using the players as the avatars to have this conversation about what does voluntary mean in the workplace. So it leads to this ridiculous thing that we do every year where we argue about who's there and who's not. And then we call people bad leaders and all of this. And it has nothing to do with the actual point. Because, let's really talk about OTAs and what goes down at OTAs. Who is needed at OTAs and who is not needed at OTAs. It's a different group of people, and it really is contextual, right? Like, it depends on who you are, how many years you've been in the league, how many years have you been with this team, what have you achieved in the league, and what is your team trying to achieve in the OTA period. All those things are important. But if we're having a conversation about should players show up to OTAs or should they not, and none of that comes up, it's because you're talking about yourself, not the actual thing. So let's talk about the actual thing. Let's actually try to have a conversation about the actual thing. Who needs to be at OTAs and who doesn't? I would make the argument your quarterback, especially if he's the starting quarterback. And when I say the starting quarterback, I mean the man on the posters, right? Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson needs to be at OTAs. Why does Deshaun Watson need to be at OTAs? It's the same reason Kevin Stefanski needs to be at OTAs. It's the same reason Alex Van Pelt needs to be at OTAs. It's the same reason Jim Schwartz needs to be OTAs, because the quarterback position is more of a coaching position at times in the offseason than it is an actual position to play. Right? It's a symbolic position. It is the middle ground between management and players on the field. So that being what that position represents, that being the highest paid position, yes, it is important that Deshaun Watson shows up, because a lot of the guys who could benefit from showing up to OTAs would benefit because Deshaun Watson is there. If Elijah Moore showed up to OTAs, but Deshaun Watson was not there, there would be no value in it for Elijah Moore. Which brings me to my other point. Who are the players in general position groups that do benefit from OTAs? I would say wide receivers, cornerbacks, safeties, linebackers sometimes. Those are the position groups that actually kind of need to be there in one capacity or another. I don't think tight end needs to be there because yes, tight ends do run routes, but in OTAs, you're really installing stuff for the skill guys, and a lot of what tight ends are doing is just blocking during OTAs. They're pretty much useless. Offensive linemen are universally useless at OTAs. In general, dudes in the trenches, useless. I'm saying like D tackles, edge rushers, pretty much pointless at OTAs. But those guys whose jobs kind of focus around physicality, there's not much you can get out of OTAs. And you can make the argument that for some guys, especially on the elite level, they would be better off doing what their prep is to become a better player at the start of the season. And remember, the goal of OTAs and the goal of the offseason for every player is to get better, right? So every player structures their offseason in a way that will make them better football players. Some guys in some position groups, that includes going to OTAs. Like Elijah Moore is a good example of this, right? He wants to get better, working out with the team, doing OTAs, working out with Deshaun Watson, that's going to help him get better this season. If you're Myles Garrett, might be different math on that. Running backs don't really have to be at OTAs, right? If you're Nick Chubb, changes the math on that, right? Because you might be better off instead of standing around in the sun for 2 hours and not really working out and getting out of your normal habits. You might be better off if you're just able to do your workouts, stay on schedule so you could get to the strength goals that you want to get to in this offseason, or the stamina goals or the cardio goals, or you see what I'm saying here, right? It can go a number of different ways, but that's where you want to get to. And if your goal is that, then your goal is going to be a lot easier to achieve if you play running back or if you're an edge rusher to be able to do your own workout and not go to OTAs. You know, the real work at OTAs is like the 7-on-7s. I do believe there's some value with that, especially when you're installing a new offense and defenses, when you're trying to get linebackers to communicate with corners and corners to communicate with safeties. All those things are very important. And OTAs does serve a purpose for those players in those groups. And that's why that's usually the groups of people who don't miss OTAs or within that bubble that I mentioned. Quarterbacks have to be there because if the quarterback is not there, and if a good quarterback is not there at OTAs, then the wide receivers can't get the work that they need. The corners can't get the work that they need. The linebackers can't get the work that they need. The safeties can't get the work that they need. And the wide receivers, I already mentioned them, they can't get the work that they need. So literally nobody there can get work done because the quarterback didn't show up. That's why it's most important that the quarterback shows up, because that's the dude that can help the most people get better. Myles Garrett, the edge rusher, not showing up does not matter. A running back not showing up does not matter, especially when we're talking about two dudes who are all pro players, like straight up all pro level play. They have shown you that you have nothing to worry about. They will be fine. I promise you, Nick Chubb and Myles Garrett will be good this year. As is my guess, right? And they don't really need any other excuse. It doesn't have to be about an ankle or another injury. They don't really need an excuse. If those two dudes have decided that OTAs are not going to be a part of the program because it's not going to make them better football players during the season, and they feel like that time could be better spent elsewhere, they have enough clout in the NFL to trust that. That's not an issue. They should be able to do that without people who've never played in the league shaking their finger at them and telling them what leadership is. Like that's silly to me. Again, a lot of the conversation that we have around this stuff, right? The OTA stuff is more about the people having the conversation than it is about OTAs itself. Because I promise you, you've probably listened to a bunch of people talk about this and you've heard all the cliches. Well, it's leadership. Oh, when I'm at work, or, when it's voluntary for me, I ain't got to show up, or when it is voluntary for me, I have to show up. All these people talking about their own job when it comes to the OTAs and not talking about OTAs. Because again, if we're talking about OTAs, you have to break it down to who does this benefit? Because it does benefit some people. If your Perion Winfrey, it doesn't benefit you from an on the field standpoint, but it certainly benefits you from an off the field standpoint to be able to shake Jim Schwartz's hand and make a good impression on him. Right? Like, that's important for Perion Winfrey. Myles Garrett, don't matter what Jim Schwartz think about Myles Garrett, he gonna have to use him, right? Like, he lives in a different world than Perion Winfrey, right? But if you are a new player like Zadarius Smith and you want to come in and meet some of the guys, this is a great opportunity to do it, so you're gonna do it. You might not need the on the field work or the drills, that's not gonna be helpful to you, but what might be helpful to you is getting to know some of your teammates, being able to bond, being in the city for the first time, and getting to know where you want to live and all of this during the year and where you might want to kick it for a year. Like, there are a bunch of benefits for a dude like Zadarius Smith to show up. There are a bunch of benefits for a dude like Dalvin Thomas. Again, he's got to meet his teammates. He's got to meet his coaches. He got to figure out where he want to stay in the city. That makes sense. But for some of these guys, it doesn't make sense because they feel like they can get the better work done elsewhere, or they live somewhere else in the off season. There's multiple reasons on why somebody would decide to go to OTAs and would not. And I don't think one or the other is inherently bad. I think these are just choices people make because we have to remember these football players want to be good more than you want your team to be good. Like, it is entertainment to us if the Browns are good. Like, it would be great. I really want them to be good. It would be helpful to me. I would make more money because more people would watch. But if you're the player, this is your livelihood. I promise you they're more dedicated. Okay? Like, this is their job. They have to be good. They have to figure out. So this is kind of my way of saying we got to trust that these dudes are making calculations to get better on the football field. Unless they have demonstrated, like an Antonio Brown, that they are not capable of doing that math, then we shouldn't assume that they're not doing that math. I think every player is doing what they feel like they need to do to be better. And that's the assumption that we should work with. And again, instead of having these conversations and making it about us when none of us are playing NFL football right now, let's actually have a conversation about what OTAs are there for, what they're useful for, who they're useful for, who does it benefit to show up. Because again, if this were Deshaun Watson not showing up, that would be a little bit of a problem. If this were Perion Winfrey not showing up, that would be a little bit of a problem. If it were Juan Thornhill, I guess that would be a little bit of a problem, right? Like, if it were some of those dudes not showing up, yes, this would be a problem. But it's not. So instead of just looking at the list of who didn't show up and who did show up and going, these guys didn't show up, bad, evaluate, well, does it make sense for them to show up here? Could they get better work here? I mean, I don't think any of us are any of us are doubting that Myles Garrett and Nick Chubb put work in the offseason. I don't think any of us are doubting that. If you are, who cares? But that you're not serious at that point because it's been proven that those dudes work really hard in the offseason. We've seen it. So that's my thoughts on this whole nonsense. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Y'all have a great day. Have a good night.